Hi everybody, welcome to our last lecture, which is in our growth and development module and relates to our first case. And this short lecture is going to touch on the relative energy availability in sport, or the acronym REDS. I'm going to start with an explanation of issues related to eating disorders and how that pertains to sport. And hopefully some of this might get you thinking about how it relates to our case. So, quick first question. Which of the following is the deadliest mental health disorder in the USA? Depression, schizophrenia, eating disorders, or bipolar disorders? And I think, given the topic of the lecture, if you guessed eating disorders, you were right. More than 225,000 Americans die annually from eating disorders. That's higher than any of those other mental health disorders. And only in the last 2 years has the opioid crisis caught up. So it's an extraordinarily profound mental health disorder and has a huge impact, and particularly because it's associated with very high levels of mortality. So this is a very basic kind of overview. If you have a good understanding in eating disorders, it's probably more nuanced, but if you don't really understand what do we mean by an eating disorder, we can break these into three general categories. Anorexia nervosa, where somebody is not eating enough food or excessively exercising so that they can keep their weight as low as possible. Bulimia nervosa, where somebody is in this binge purge cycle, so they overeat and then they purge, usually through vomiting or taking laxatives. And then binge eating, where somebody eats excessively for a short period of time in an out of control manner and feels compelled to do so on a regular basis, but may not be purging. So the symptoms for an individual who has an eating disorder, the most classic symptom is they spend an inordinate amount of time worrying about their weight and their body shape. They have body dysmorphia. They look in the mirror, they don't see the body they're in, they see this much larger body, and they want that body to be different, smaller, or more muscular in the case of, say, bodybuilders. They tend to avoid any social situations where there's food. They eat very little. They are very, very excessive in terms of their habits around food. They will deliberately make themselves sick or take laxatives after eating. There are excessive exercises, and there's mood changes and other physical signs. Feeling cold because of the drop in body fat, or tired or dizzy because cardiovascular problems start to emerge. And regularly there's problems with digestion. So if you suspect somebody you know has an eating disorder, these sorts of symptoms play out. You see a dramatic weight loss. They tend not to be truthful about when they've eaten, how much they've eaten. They often go to the bathroom after eating and come back looking flushed, which is a sign that they've vomited. They exercise excessively, and they're very obsessive about exercising. They can't miss a session even when they're sick. They don't like eating in public, and they often wear baggy clothes just to hide the weight loss. So when we think about eating disorders, and we already have said that this is, high mortality rates, and this is from the National Initiative on Eating Disorders. These data are probably a little out of date now, but they're still very relevant. Particularly a problem with women. It's not exclusively a female disorder, there are men too, but for women in their late teens to mid-20s, eating disorders are among the top 4 leading causes of burden of disease in terms of that years of life lost either through death or disability. Anorexia has one of the highest mortality rates of any psychiatric disorder. It's higher than depression, alcoholism, 12 times higher than in the general population. Highest suicide rate. It's really scary. And up to 10% of women with anorexia will likely die due to anorexia-related causes. And often the death is a complication, either suicide or because of starvation. They really have serious cardiovascular problems. So incredibly sad as a disorder with an incredibly profound impact on health. And why is this? Well, it's extraordinary to think that more than 13 million Americans binge eat, more than 10 million females battle anorexia or bulimia, and more than 1 million men. So, this is a really serious issue affecting millions of individuals, and it starts young, it starts in childhood. So, when we think about that, there's this cult of thinness, and we see it all the time in social media. So, the time spent on social media is high, very much so in adolescence, but it's become younger. Our children, young children, have iPads and they have phones. They borrow your phone, and they see all this imagery of images of other people, females, that they want to attain. And the likelihood then is that they start to develop eating disorders. If you think of the average American woman, and the average Canadian woman wouldn't be a lot different. They'd be about 5'4" and weigh 140 pounds. But most of the females that you see in social media are models. They're about 5'11" and they only weigh 110 pounds. So this is a cult of thinness. It's not new. It already originated around the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, actually being larger was idolized. It meant you were quite wealthy. You actually had enough to eat luxuriously, and you didn't have to do manual labor. But during the Industrial Revolution, it became a status symbol for men to provide for the family, and so wives became too frail or weak to work. And that frailness, that weakness, was associated with a high socioeconomic status and good moral values. And it literally arose, the cult of thinness, as a status symbol for men. And if that wasn't enough for you to reject the ideal of thinness, well, then the data on how harmful it is should. What's extraordinary is the diet industry. It's worth an estimated 40 billion a year, and I think these data are out of date because this hasn't accounted for the surge in GLP receptor drugs that we've had most recently, Ozempic being one brand of a GLP receptor drug for weight loss. And it's thought that over 400 million are Weight Watchers. They're paying their, monthly subscription to Weight Watchers. And at the time of this, from the National Eating Disorders, there was about 570 million Americans who were on some kind of weight loss drug, and that didn't include the Ozempic, all of these other GLP receptor drugs. So, this is an industry that's getting very rich on people wanting to be thin. And think about now the harm that it has to health. And this data in the bottom of our slide here is hospitalizations due to eating disorders. And I think this is the most staggering. Over 119 hospitalizations are children under 12 years of age. It's staggering, that statistic. And data's shown that 80% of 10-year-olds are afraid of being fat. More staggering is 42% of grade 1 to 3. That's super young children, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds. Nearly half of those want to be thinner. So that ideal that they're seeing in social media has already impacted. And I think it's really scary that this problem starts in childhood with the media children consume, but also how we as adults talk about our bodies around our children. So talking about eating disorders matters, and here's some, I think, key facts that we have to remember. Eating disorders are a medical illness. They have genetic antecedents, environmental influences. It's not a trend or a choice. It's actually a medical disorder. It's a pathology. They are serious, can be fatal. They don't discriminate. They can affect anybody, all ages, races, ethnicities, and genders. And you can't tell by looking at someone if they have an eating disorder. Some people who can be underweight, some people can be normal weight, some people can be overweight. A big myth is that the family member causes the eating disorder, and they're not the cause, and they actually can be a great source of support, so they can be the best ally in treatment. And importantly, you can recover from an eating disorder. It takes time, but complete recovery is possible. So let's think about how this impacts sport. So these are some studies that have been published, say in the last, I think these are kind of across the last 10 or so years. If we take female high school athletes in athletic sports, gymnastics, figure skating, those sports, 42% reported disordered eating. And those 42% were 8 times more likely to incur an injury than the same young girls who were in the same athletic sports who did not report disordered eating. And then that's a staggering statistic. And although most athletes, we tend to think of this as a female problem, male athletes are also at risk. And these are particularly in sports that emphasize diet or appearance, size and weight. So there are weight class sports like rowing and wrestling, becoming a jockey in horse racing. There are aesthetic sports where the way you look matters, bodybuilding, gymnastics, swimming, diving. And about 33% of young male athletes are affected. And if we add the weight class sports and the aesthetic sports together for the females, it's about 62% who have disordered eating patterns. I think this is concerning. We're going to come back to the trainers because athletic trainers, coaches, you're in a position of power. You have a lot of influence and sway over the athletes you're training because they are driven young people who want to be the best, and they will believe and do pretty much anything the coach wants them to. So there's a real need for coaches and athletic trainers. There's a code of conduct that's needed. And the team that supports the young athlete should also be multifaceted. It shouldn't just be the trainer. There should be psychologists and nutritionists. So in a survey of athletic trainers, only 27% felt confident that they could identify one of their athletes who had an eating disorder. And despite this, 91% reported dealing with an athlete who actually had an eating disorder. And over 90% felt that more attention needed to be paid to preventing eating disorders, particularly amongst collegial athletes. A quarter of all athletic trainers in collegial sport work at an institution without any policy on managing eating disorders. I don't know if UBC has a policy. So let's talk about energy availability and then put this together with RED-S and see how it impacts exercise when sport and exercise and training come into play and how it might impact our young athlete. So what do we mean by energy availability? Well, energy availability is simply the available energy after if you take what you've eaten in the day, your intake, minus your exercise energy expenditure, and divide that by your lean body mass. That gives you your energy availability in kilocalories per kilo of lean mass per day. If this number goes below 30, this is a serious deficit in energy availability where all sorts of serious health complications start to occur. And we'll go into those in a bit more detail. So imagine you're an athlete, you have 46 kilos of fat-free or lean mass. You've consumed 2,500 kilocalories and you've expended about 500. You can figure out where your energy availability lies and whether it's low. In finding this magic number of 30, there's been multiple studies and they've looked at different numbers. Some looked at as low as 24, some looked at 40s. And really this is the number that they kind of hit on as a cut point. So what does it mean to have low energy availability? Well, there's risk factors. You could be unintentionally reducing the energy availability by having a really excessive amount of exercise. So you remember you've consumed your calories, but the calories burnt. Imagine you're running 20K hard on a daily basis. You're struggling to keep up the intake to match the expenditure. So that would be maybe unintentional, maybe misguided. There's misguided but intentional. You're intentionally controlling your body mass. You don't necessarily have disordered eating, but you're trying to change your body mass, but you don't have a good understanding of nutrition. And then the third category is that compulsive, the eating disordered. They are controlling their body mass through an eating disorder. So the risk factor is the same. There's a drive to reduce body mass or percent body fat, and that drive means inadequate intake of calories or excessive expenditure. So we can look at dietary energy intake, and if it's insufficient to support the expenditure, then your health, your performance, everything starts to reduce. And this is a simple diagram where it looks like it's on a scale where if daily energy intake is sufficient or insufficient, these factors start to get impacted. And that's where the word REDS comes from. This is this relative energy deficiency. And it's specifically related to sport. So it came from what we used to call the female athlete triad, where there was inadequate energy availability, it impacted menstrual function, and we'd see reduced bone function, loss of bone, and predisposition to stress factors. And it includes this, but it adds a whole series of other factors that are also valuable. And it's now not specific for females, it's for males and females. So REDS can include symptoms and outcomes for males, such as lowered testosterone levels, as well as the irregular menstrual cycle in the female. So the REDS encompasses the earlier identified triad, but it's a broader way of looking at the risk from inadequate energy intake. And how does this impact our young athlete? Well, this is a graph I've shown you, and we're going to go back to this. This was a study done in Israel by Elakim and Nemeth, and they looked at both IGF and growth hormone, the IGF growth hormone axes measured by IGF, and they looked at a marker of an inflammatory biomarker, interleukin-6, and how they altered with high levels of exercise training, what happened if you kept those high levels up, or what happened if you dropped the training and tapered down to these particular markers. And the top graph shows that with very high levels of training, IGF-1 declines, and that's your major stimulus for growth. If you keep training, it stays low. If you taper off exercise, it returns, and in fact, it exceeds baseline measures. So the reverse is the case for interleukin, because with high levels of training, inflammation goes up. It will stay high if you keep overtraining. So IL-6 is a good biomarker of that. And if you reduce training, you see this decline in this inflammatory biomarker, which is a good thing. So a chronically elevated IL-6 is associated with stunted growth. Inadequate caloric intake, so this vastly poor energy balance, this imbalance results in changes to the secretion of hormones. It has endocrine consequences, and it increases inflammation. It's having serious health consequences, and together you see stunted growth. If you reduce training, your IGF levels resume and growth resumes. So you can see that in some of the literature that was part of our debate. Kane argued that resumption of growth is exactly what you see in this graph. Once you reduce training, you see the IGF growth hormone endocrine system returning to normal, and growth resumes. So REDS primarily is something, as we said, there's a primarily female condition, not exclusively female condition, but we do see in males change in endocrine function, so in sex steroids in both sexes. In females, when we think about change in menstrual function, we can put it into three categories. Primary amenorrhea means that you haven't started, menarche has not started, and it's delayed and it's late. And by being delayed and late, we use a cutoff of 15 years. If menarche has not started by 15 years of age, it's primary amenorrhea. Secondary amenorrhea is where menses has started, but then you start missing cycles. And 3 consecutive cycles missed is classified as secondary amenorrhea. And that's really high in dancers and in long distance runners, and probably in gymnasts too. And oligomenorrhea is where you do have regular cycles, but they're not occurring in the normal time frame. So every 21 days you have your period. In this case, you can have cycles that can last 45 to 50 days before having a period. So all 3 are problematic. And the conceptualization of REDS is this relative energy deficit. The original female athlete triad just touched on bone health and menstrual function, but we've seen already in the young athlete that it impacts the endocrine system, so we get this reduction in IGF-1. It has an immunological impact. Inflammation goes up, interleukin-6. It has gastrointestinal outcomes, cardiovascular, there are psychological, growth can be delayed, hematological, metabolic, and so on. So it's a really multifaceted disorder. And again, we take that concept where if you've dropped your calories below 30 kilocalories per kilo of lean mass, that's my cat and I apologize, then you have a problem. So we kind of know what these high-risk sports are. So we know the cross-country distance, particularly distance runners, but also cyclists. There's some really interesting data coming out that, being light in distance sports matters. You deal better with heat. There's less mass to carry around. And there's some data now showing that some of these elite athletes are going onto these GLP receptors because drugs like I've lost the name of the manufacturer, but the GLP receptor class drugs, they're not yet on the banned list for WADA, International Anti-Doping Agency, the worldwide anti-doping agency. So they're taking these to lose weight so they perform better. So this is a real problem. Athletes in sports where we said already aesthetics are emphasized. So this also can include bodybuilding and athletes who are in weight class sports such as wrestling and rowing. And it says here the cox, but the cox is not the only rower. Rowing has a lightweight class, and getting down to that weight, rowers are very tall individuals and they have to be really thin. And these athletes, particularly wrestlers and rowers and jockeys, they have to be weighed in at competitions. So they will get up early and for 2 hours exercise with a plastic bag over them so they can lose water so that they can make the weigh-in and then try and drink water before the actual competition. There's some very disordered eating and drinking behaviors in these weight class athletes. So there are screening tools, and I think this is interesting and I think it's relevant. So there's the LEAF questionnaire. It asks demographic data. It asks about injuries. It asks about gastrointestinal function. And it has a female element where it asks about menstrual function. So have you had your first period, menarche? What age were you at? Is it normal? Is there amenorrhea? Are there any changes to your cycle? It also asks about contraceptive use. And this is really important because lots of young athletes are put on contraceptives by their coaches to aid weight loss. So there has to be good reason for contraceptive use, and it shouldn't be about weight loss. So this can be used to track risk. And if the athlete starts to score 8 or more, you start to get concerned that they are indeed at risk for low energy availability. And I think this is relevant for young athletes. I think coaches need to be educated, and they have to help educate their young athletes. And it's not just at the behest of the coach. Elite sport needs a team. It has to have psychology, there have to be nutrition. And the young athlete has to learn to ask themselves questions about whether or not they may be at risk of having low energy availability. And these are very simple questions. And sometimes, we're all intent on trying to increase our performance. And we know we feel maybe excessively tired or maybe excessively sore, but we don't really think about it. We're so driven to that goal of increasing performance. So getting a young athlete to track sleep and feelings of whether they feel refreshed or they feel tired all the time, whether they're excessively sore and don't feel that they can recover. For the team, they should be tracking the performance of that young that young athlete. And if their coach sees that they're not improving, and if the athlete feels they're not improving, then again, that's a good prompt for further discussion. Does the young athlete feel that they have big mood swings? Have they had injuries recurring in the past year, particularly a stress fracture, because that's a symptom that bone health is being compromised? Are they frequently ill? If you have high levels of inflammation, you're going to have depleted immune function and you get sick a lot. And of course, for the females, is their menstrual cycle irregular, lighter than normal, or completely absent? So these are really important tools that a coach can use. So I'm going to finish with the fixation of this thin image in sport. So it's, multifaceted. We've got our sports like gymnastics, like dance, like cheerleading, like figure skating. We've got our elite endurance athletes, and the coaches put a lot of pressure on these young athletes to be thin because they feel that they're going to perform better. And don't get me wrong, certain sports do require leanness, but not at the point where now you're cutting corners on athlete health. So these are some headliners in the last few years that broke around these elite athletes being really abused by the coaching program that they were in. We know all about some of the abuse beyond eating disorders in gymnastics. It's happened in the USA, it's happened in Canada. And I'm going to show you a video, hopefully it works, which is a really neat example of that coach abuse of young athletes, and the team is inadequate. There's no checks and balances. And this is collegial level athletics. And it's the Mary Kay Nike controversy of the around 2010, 2011. So let's see if this works.
I was the fastest girl in America.
Mary Kay, there are women here almost twice her age, being lifted in her weight.
I set many national records, and I was a straight A student. When I was 16, I got a call from Alberto Salazar at Nike. He was the world's most famous track coach, and he told me I was the most talented athlete he'd ever seen. During my freshman year in college, I moved out to train with him and his team full-time at Nike World Headquarters. It was a team of the fastest athletes in the world, and it was a dream come true. I joined Nike because I wanted to be the best female athlete ever. Instead, I was emotionally and physically abused by a system designed by Alberto and endorsed by Nike. This is what happened to me. When I first arrived, an all-male Nike staff became convinced that in order for me to get better, I had to become thinner and thinner and thinner. This Nike team was the top running program in the country. And yet we had no certified sports psychologist, there was no certified nutritionist. It was really just a bunch of people who were Alberto's friends. So when I went to anybody for help, they would always just tell me the same thing, and that was to listen to Alberto. Alberto was constantly trying to get me to lose weight. He created an arbitrary number of 114 pounds, and he would usually weigh me in front of my teammates and publicly shame me if I wasn't hitting weight. He wanted to give me birth control pills and diuretics to lose weight, the latter of which isn't allowed in track and field. I ran terrible during this time, but reached a point where I was on the starting line and I'd lost the race before I started, because in my head, all I was thinking of was not the time I was trying to hit, but the number on the scale I saw earlier that day. It would be naive to not acknowledge the fact that weight is important in sports. It's like boxers need to maintain a certain weight, or, everybody always ends up citing the math about how the thinner you are, the faster you're gonna run because you have to carry less weight. But here's a biology lesson I learned the hard way. When young women are forced to push themselves beyond what they're capable at their given age, they're at risk for developing REDS. Suddenly, you realize you've lost your period for a couple months, and then a couple months becomes a couple years, and in my case, it was a total of 3. And if you're not getting your period, you're not going to be able to have the necessary levels of estrogen to maintain strong bone health. And in my case, I broke 5 different bones. The New York Times Magazine published a story about how Alberto was training me and nurturing my talent. We weren't doing any of that. I felt so scared, I felt so alone, and I felt so trapped. And I started to have suicidal thoughts. I started to cut myself. Some people saw me cutting myself, and sorry, nobody really did anything or said anything. So in 2015, I ran this race, and I didn't run super well. And afterwards, there was a thunderstorm going on. Half the track was under one tent. Alberto yelled at me in front of everybody else at the meet. And he told me that I clearly gained 5 pounds before the race. It was also that night that I told Alberto and our sports psych that I was cutting myself, and they pretty much told me they just wanted to go to bed. And I think for me, that was my kick in the head where I was like, this system is sick. I think even for my parents in certain ways, once I finally vocalized to them, I mean, they were horrified. They bought me the first plane ride home, and they were like, get on that flight, get the hell out of there. I wasn't even trying to make the Olympics anymore. I was just trying to survive. So I made the painful choice, and I quit the team.
After a multi-year investigation, the U.S. anti-doping agency has banned Alberto Salazar from the sport for 4 years.
Nike will shut down the Oregon project.
Nike CEO Mark Parker stepping down from the company in January of 2020.
Those reforms are mostly a direct result of the doping scandal. They're not acknowledging the fact that there's a systemic crisis in women's sports and at Nike, in which young girls' bodies are being ruined by an emotionally and physically abusive system. That's what needs to change, and here's how we can do it. First, Nike needs to change. In track and field, Nike is all-powerful. They control the top coaches, athletes, races, even the governing body. You can't just fire a coach and eliminate a program and pretend the problem is solved. My worry is that Nike's merely going to rebrand the old program and put Alberto's old assistant coaches in charge. Secondly, we need more women in power. Part of me wonders if I had worked with more female psychologists, nutritionists, and even coaches, where I'd be today. I got caught in a system designed by and for men, which destroys the bodies of young girls. Rather than force young girls to fend for themselves, we have to protect them. I genuinely do have hope for the sport, and I plan to be running for many years to come. And so part of the reason I'm doing this now is I want to end this chapter, and I want to start a new one.
So I think that's super interesting. See if we can get back to, oopsie, get back to my, get back to my class. It really makes you think about the support team needed in youth sport, and I think that's the big take home there. So that pretty much concludes growth and development. On Wednesday, we'll just have a little bit of time at the very beginning of class, just some consolidation of our case study. Now we've got a full, if you like, armory of information. You should be in good shape to tackle it. And we're going to be starting on our next case. I'm not going to introduce the case study on Wednesday, but we're going to just talk through some basic principles of exercise testing. I'm going to be refreshing your exercise physiology and exercise laboratory testing of aerobic fitness. And we're going to have an article for you to read, which I'm not going to read the whole piece, but it's a nice refresher, if you like, of XPhys. And we'll start with our very first class, recorded class on Friday, where we'll look at children in the laboratory in particularly measurement of aerobic fitness. See you on Wednesday.